because I've always thought of Joy to the World as basically one of the things you sing at Christmas and one of the things you hear played in the supermarkets, don't think I'd really tuned in to the way in which actually it expresses in, I take it, a robust 18th century form. Who wrote Joy to the World? What date? Watts, yeah, so it's 18th century. I mean, there's something about those 18th century hymn writers where there is a robust sense of God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven, and there's a transition takes place, wouldn't you know, late 18th, early 19th century, and people stop writing about that and they start writing about going off somewhere else where God is going to be king, which will be safe and away from the world. And in other words, the idea of God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven is simply lost at that point in much of the Western tradition. I think we have to be sensitive to these things and to celebrate the things which actually get it right. And there's a lot of good stuff in the 19th century. Some of my favourite music was written in the 19th century. I mean, you know, Schubert and Brahms and people like that. But there's also within the church a great declining away from an 18th century vision. Not that they got it all right, but you hear what I say. There's something which is hugely important there. And the reason I asked for those themes to come out in this morning's music is because today we want to look at Acts really 1 to 12. We've done a bit of 1 and 2 yesterday, but I want to try and share with you something of this large sweep. I found when I was teaching in Oxford many years ago that often the students who had been to lectures by a variety of professors had gotten used to thinking of the New Testament in terms of tiny little bits. Here's these 3 or 4 verses which mean this, and this little passage which means that, and they never got the big picture. And sometimes I would come in and would do a tutorial and just do the whole of John in 1 hour. And they would say, now I get it. And something, in Myers-Briggs terms, it's biblical studies is much easier to get a PhD in biblical studies if you're an ISTJ than if you're an ENFP. Well, the P would never get the PhD anyway, because they just would never finish it. But the ST bit is how a lot of people do biblical studies. Cut it up into little bits and then just analyze the little bits. And don't worry about putting them all back together. And as you gather, I'm a strong NF myself, and I just love that big picture. And when you've got the big picture, then the bits come up in 3 dimensions. And so I hope that's something of what we may conceivably experience today. And I want to begin with Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost, Acts 2:14 to 36. Acts 2:14 to 36. Because this sets the tone and context for everything that is going to come. And the basic point of the speech, explaining the event that has just taken place, this extraordinary outpouring of the Spirit, the rushing mighty wind and the tongues of fire, and the people speaking so that folk think they're drunk, and so on. The explanation is that this is the fulfillment of the new covenant promises of God. Peter is quoting from the book of the prophet Joel, and these are the prophecies about what's going to happen in the last days. In other words, he is implicitly at least telling the story of the people of God as having now arrived at its new moment. This is the new day that the prophets were talking about. And already you get this sense bubbling up in the earliest days of Christianity that they know where they are in the story. We're not talking about individual, isolated human beings doing some sort of a deal with God in some ahistorical framework. There is a narrative, the narrative is going forward, and this is the place it's got to, the place where now at last the Spirit gets poured out. And why has this happened? Because of Jesus. Verses 22 and following, one of the great messianic expositions in the New Testament. The exposition of Jesus as Messiah on the basis of the resurrection. This is foundational to early Christology. I said last night the resurrection means God's new world has begun and we've got a job to do. But in the middle of that, it's because Jesus really is the Messiah. He was crucified as a would-be Messiah, a messianic pretender. That was the charge at the trial. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And it was the charge nailed up above his head. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Hugely ironic, the King of the Jews on a cross. Who ever heard of such a thing? And the resurrection says, despite appearances, that's who he really was. And all of this theology gets scrunched together into a formula which we find in the beginning of Paul's letter to the Romans. Jesus descended from the seed of David according to the flesh and designated Son of God, that's a messianic title, in power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. The resurrection demonstrates that the Davidic messianic claim of Jesus really was true all along. He didn't become Son of God at the resurrection. He was publicly designated what he was already, as we see elsewhere in Paul. That's a whole other story. So that then the long quotation you see in verses 25, 6, 7, and 8, where we're quoting from the Psalms here, that you will not abandon my soul to Hades or let your Holy One experience corruption. Interesting, when I was working on the book on resurrection, whenever was that? 2002, I guess. I realized that most of the New Testament scholars who've written about resurrection basically ignored this passage. They went to 1 Corinthians 15 and other well-known passages like that, and they went, of course, to the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. But here, just in case there was any doubt about what resurrection actually means, verse 27 and then verses 29, 30, 31, it's clear that resurrection means bodies. Resurrection means a new physicality, that Jesus' body did not corrupt. Instead, it was transformed, and now he is alive with the same body but transformed into a non-corruptible physicality, something which, again, takes imagination. By the way, you quoted that John Lennon song, Imagine There's No Heaven, and so on. There's something very ironic about that. A couple of times in my books, I have wanted to quote that song, Imagine There's No Heaven, and the publishers have said, do you know how much it'll cost you if you quote that? You know, because Yoko Ono still claims massive royalties every time anyone quotes that, which is very ironic considering the next verse of the song. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. This Jesus God raised up, verse 32, and of this we are all witnesses. And that's why the Spirit is poured out, because Jesus is now the Lord of the world, and he is equipping his followers to be agents of his kingdom. Remember, it's his kingdom. We're not talking about a bullying, arrogant theocracy in which the church goes and basically forces the world to do whatever the church wants it to. We're talking about a theocracy in which it is Jesus, the one who announced the kingdom of God by going around healing and feasting and helping the weak and the meek and so on. But the result of this, verse 34, another psalm, is that we're in Psalm 110 country. And this is so important for the whole of early Christianity. Psalm 110 gets quoted again and again and again by Jesus himself, of course, in Mark 12 and so on. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. And the early church went on, going back to Psalm 110 to find out exactly what it meant, exactly who Jesus was. You get it in the letter to the Hebrews, expounding the very, to us, odd and remote bit about Melchizedek, not odd and remote in first century terms, of course. But the idea, therefore, of Jesus' enthronement. Jesus is raised from the dead. Therefore, he is the Messiah. He is enthroned as the one who shares the very name and throne of God. He is the Lord. He is the Kyrios. He is, dare we say, the Yahweh. And you find in various parts of the New Testament, Kyrios in the Septuagint, which carries the divine name Yahweh, being applied directly to Jesus. And then we pull back from this initial statement of the reign of Jesus the Messiah, the Lord. And we say, look at the whole of Acts 2 to 12. And what do we see? We see Jesus being announced as King, as Messiah, as Lord. And at the end of that sequence, finally, Herod, who has been in the background all along, comes out and says, actually, there is already a king of the Jews, and there can't be two such people. Therefore, I'm going to stamp you out. And in chapter 12, as you know, there is the clash, we mentioned it last night, where Herod kills James, the brother of John, and then he wants to kill Peter. You sort of start with the number 2 or 3 person and see how that's going to play, because if people don't like it, well, it may not be hugely serious, but actually people do like it. So, right, let's go for the big guy now. So we go for Peter, and this time, for whatever reason, the church is praying, and the angel comes and gets Peter out of prison. We'll come back to that towards the end. So I want you to hold this entire first half of the book, chapters 1 to 12. Within that framework, Jesus is announced as King of the Jews. And the news of Jesus as King and Lord inevitably generates a clash with the present authorities. And though Herod himself only comes on stage at the end of that sequence, and say he's been in the background, it's rather like in Luke's Gospel. We don't meet that King Herod that often, but in fact he's in the background, and when he finally emerges in the trial scene where Jesus is sent to Herod and then Herod and Pilate become friends, we realize that this issue of kingdom, of kingship, has been on the agenda all through. But interwoven with this theme of lordship and kingship is the second theme, again that I mentioned last night, and we saw it in relation to the coming together of heaven and earth, which is the theme of the temple. Now, Messiah and temple, as I hope you know, belong closely together. David wants to build the temple. God says, well, you can't do it, but your son will. 2 Samuel 7, another key Christological text as the early church reads the Old Testament. When God says to David, I will raise up your seed after you who will sit on your throne. He will be my son, I will be his father, and he will build me a house. God's answer, this is hugely important for understanding the incarnation. God's answer to David's request that he, David, should build a place on the earth where the living God will truly dwell, God's answer to that is, well, sort of, but actually, I am going to give you a child, and I will be his father, and he will be my son. In other words, really, the place where God wants to dwell on earth is not a house made with bricks and mortar. It is a human being from the family of David. And this human being from the family of David will himself be the temple builder. And so the immediate fulfillment is, of course, Solomon, and Solomon is the king, great David's greater son, who then does build the temple, and who then is the one who consecrates it and becomes the great wise king, and the ends of the earth come to hear his wisdom. That's a whole other theme, wisdom, another great Christological theme. But this pattern of king as himself the bearer of the promise, but then also as the temple builder, continues right the way on through. You see, in the great stories in Kings and Chronicles, the greatest kings are the ones who cleanse or rebuild the temple. Hezekiah and Josiah, they're the ones who stand out. And after the exile, the reason Zerubbabel doesn't get off the ground is he doesn't actually manage to rebuild the temple in such a way that God will come back and live in it. And there's this constant tension in the so-called Second Temple period. Is this really the new temple? Have we really refounded the temple? Because after all, at no point in the Second Temple period does it say that Yahweh has come back to live in the temple. The glory departed from the temple, as you know, in the book of Ezekiel, when Ezekiel has this vision of the Shekinah glory, the whirling wheels, doing a vertical takeoff from the temple and going off into the wilderness. At no point does it say that he's come back. Malachi, written well into the Second Temple period, says that he will come back, but then, as we shall see later on, Isaiah 66 says, why would you want to build a temple for God? Actually, heaven and the highest heavens can't contain him. So maybe it was a category mistake all along. So there's a tension there. And we find already now in Acts chapter 2, and then going on, that if Jesus and now even the church are the place where heaven and earth overlap, we are going to run into problems, to put it mildly, in relation to the existing temple in Jerusalem. And hence within these two themes, the lordship of Jesus, Jesus as king and lord over against all the other authorities, and the worship, the temple, within all this, we have acted out again in Acts what you have in the gospel story. The welcome, the challenge, the warning of the kingdom, the welcome of the kingdom and the generation of a new community that are the kingdom people. The challenge of the kingdom, are you up for this? Do you realize what will happen, how it's going now? And the warning, what happens if you don't take it seriously. And so from the end of chapter 2 right through to the end of chapter 11, allow 1 and 2 at one end and then 12 at the other to be sort of bookends for this whole section of Acts, and divide the rest of it from chapter 2 verse 37, that's after the Peter speech, the result of Peter's speech, beginning at chapter 2 verse 37, right through to the end of chapter 11. I'm going to divide that into 3 more, with the centerpiece being the speech of Stephen, well, the whole Stephen incident. So the centerpiece, think of it as a sort of an arch. You've got chapters 1 and 2 over here. You've got chapter 12 over here. If I had been better prepared, I would have had visual aids and PowerPoint presentations, and I could have done this prettily. My son, who is a university lecturer, says, "Dad, you should do it. It's so easy. I'll teach you how." And I say, "I just don't have time to do all that technology. I'm sorry about that." But I hope you can see it in your mind's eye. 1 and 2 over here, 12 over here. And then in the middle, the coping stone of the arch, the place where this temple claim comes home to roost in the Stephen speech, chapter 6 verse 8 through to chapter 8 verse 3, if you're taking notes. And then the 2 things immediately either side of that, the first section, chapter 2 verse 37 through to chapter 6 verse 7, that's 2:37 to 6:7, and then the other side of the Stephen speech, chapter 8 verse 4 to chapter 11 verse 30. And just so that you see how this works, let's just characterize it like this. And each time I do this, it comes out slightly different. So these headings are not set in stone. They're just an attempt to probe and see what's going on in Luke's mind. From 2 verse 37 to 6 verse 7, the church as the alternative temple. 2:37 to 6:7, the church as the alternative temple. And then 6:8 to 8:3, Stephen and the judgment on the old temple. And then chapter 8 verse 4 through to, you see, the point is, in all those great eschatological promises in ancient Judaism, there is this sense that when God does for Israel what God is going to do for Israel, then the whole of the rest of the world will get in on the act as well. Psalm 72 again. When the Messiah, the Son of David, is enthroned, his dominion will be from one sea to the other, from the river to the ends of the earth. The idea of the rest of the world coming to worship the God of Israel and to be submissive to the King of Israel, this is a deeply, deeply ingrained Old Testament theme. And so what you've got is the church as the new temple, worshipping the one who is Israel's true king. Then the great clash, the Stephen speech, where it becomes clear, yes, we really do mean this, and we're ending with the vision of Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And then the result, the word goes out, and the Samaritans and then the Gentiles get to hear it. And so you have the stories of Philip and then Paul and then Peter, as we'll see in the third of those bits.